Not a nice
Well,
day here. Yeah.
well, I mean, that's the reason why you like to live in Florida in the winter time, because
Yeah,
it's so
for
beautiful down
sure.
here. Great. Okay, so I think, should I begin? I mean, does everybody, I have three on my watch. Everybody else hopefully is about the same, so I don't want to, and if anybody else hooks on after, great. All right, we were now studying the Tosfos, and again, we're concentrating primarily in the 12th and 13th centuries in France and Germany. I would say the key Tosfos, certainly of that first generation, they are the French Rabbanim. Those are the key ones. The first, actually half of Tosfos are quotations from Rabbi Meir, who was actually Rashi's son-in-law. And then the very next great Tosfos, or Baal Tosfos, I should say, Baal Tosfos, is Rabbeinu Tam, and that's who we had been learning about. He was a key personality. He was obviously a man of besides great intelligence and brilliance, he became a community leader. So he's not just known for all this sage advice and his writings and what he contributed to Tosfos, in addition to his own sefer that he's famous for, called Sefer HaYashar. But as I say, he was a communal leader and greatly, highly respected in France, and actually it would be France and Germany. And ultimately, obviously, people in Spain will be hearing about him and will be studying his works. So I just want to tell you, I didn't have a chance to finish last time what actually happened to him towards the end of his life, or partway into his life. He actually lived, I think around 1170. I think that's the date I have for him. Let me just go back to my last page here that I was on. Right, he was born in the year 1100 and died in the year 1171. But what happened to him during the Second Crusade? We learned a lot about that First Crusade and how those communities along the Rhine River, they were so brutally attacked, and hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed there. But during the Second Crusade, there's still these marauding mobs breaking into where the Jews are living, in Germany, and wreaking havoc and destruction and murdering people. I'm going to tell you what happened after Rabbeinu Tam. In the year 1146, again, so he's 46 years old, during the Second Crusade, a rampaging mob sacked Rabbeinu Tam's house and almost took his life. Many legends abound regarding this event, and all of them cast his survival as a miraculous event. One thing they say, actually, when they broke into his house, they actually desecrated a Torah scroll, that he had there, and that apparently he was attacked literally, with a knife, and they said he had 5 knife wounds in his head, from this mob breaking in. And actually, it was a nobleman. I don't know. Obviously, somebody that he knew, and he knew what a key personality Rabbeinu Tam was, so he stepped in and then stopped before he was actually murdered. But as a result of this, it made him that much more sensitive to his fellow Jew and to what they were going through. Rabbeinu Tam's compassion for his fellow Jews only increased after this horrific experience. His understanding of his co-religionist dangerous and abject situation in Christian Europe intensified, and his attitude towards the non-Jewish world became ever more wary. No wonder, right? Soon after the attack on his person, Rabbeinu Tam left Ramerupt, and I go to, these are all these towns whose names I'm going to be mentioning. They are east of Paris, but I don't think they're quite in Alsace-Lorraine. So it's area in between, right? Those two locales. And he returned to the home of his grandfather, Rashi, who had lived in Troyes. Remember, Rashi knew that he had learned in Mainz under Rabbeinu Gershom, but then he had returned to France and where he sat and learned and wrote so many of his great works was in the city of Troyes. And that's spelled, just if you're not sure, Troyes. So I had taken French for a few years, so I do know somewhat how to pronounce everything. The Jewish world was in turmoil as many Jewish communities had failed or were faltering. The exile became an intensified reality among the wandering groups of Jews fleeing their French homes. Many of Rabbeinu Tam's disciples left France for England and Germany. I think that was interesting. Either they went eastward or they actually went westward, and where they felt life would be better. You'll see. I don't think life was any better in Germany, and ultimately won't be any better in England either. But I guess at this juncture, they felt those areas were more secure. With their departure, the central yeshivos of France continued to decline. By the time of Rabbeinu Tam's death in 1171, the French Jewish community felt itself dying, though the schools and scholarship of the Tosfos would continue to be concentrated in France for the next century. So we'll go on for some time, obviously, again, into the 13th century, and we will be learning about the Jews there in the 14th century as well, but obviously it becomes increasingly precarious to live there. All right. The antipathy aroused by the Crusades also gave rise to spate of blood libel. So when I had done a whole lecture just several weeks ago on all the forms of anti-Semitism that rose to the fore here, starting around that year 1100. So we talked about the fact that blood libel was one of, and even though I won't always be mentioning this blood libel or that blood libel, it was like a constant refrain throughout these centuries. And periodically, the Jews would be accused of it. A body of a child might be found, and, they're unsure who actually murdered. Oh, well, it's always easy to blame the Jews. And then there was that awful thing, the host desecration, just to repeat, that's when you would take the little wafer that they would use in communion, and then they felt like the Jews would take these like knives and, like stab it as if they're stabbing, again, the body of Christ. What I mean, to me, it's unfathomable, but they actually believe this. Again, it was a very superstitious lifestyle at this point. And then the fact that the Jews, again, have to wear this yellow badge. Now, there are going to be more things coming to the fore as we progress in Jewish history during this medieval time. But I like to compartmentalize them and do it, century by century, so when these various accusations came to the fore. So now we had learned that the first blood libel was actually in England. All right, but now we're going to talk about what happened in France, another famous blood libel case. So the antipathy aroused by the Crusades gave rise to a spate of blood libels. I mean, they're already filled, with some venom and hatred against the Jews. So all these things that they obviously been floating around and they've heard about, all they need is a pretext, and again, there'll be an accusation. In the year 1171, okay, this is Rabbeinu Tam, death. The entire community of Blois, that's B-L-O-I-S, met a martyr's death as a result of such an accusation. And I have here a map of France. So Paris is here, and Blois, the city of Blois, is to the south of it. All right. Again, I don't know how many kilometers this is, but it's a little bit ways down on the map. So who was ruling France at this time? There was a boy king. His name was Philip II, and he ruled actually then from a bit later. The dates here don't seem to correspond with 1171, so I'm not going to repeat them. All right. He ardently believed in this myth, and soon after his coronation, he had the Jews in. Oh no! So there was this thing, right, in Blois, right, where there was this blood libel accusation, and many Jews, lost their death. Now I'm going on to a new king. His name was Philip II from 1180 to 1223. He ardently believed in this myth, and in 1181, soon after his coronation, he had the Jews in Paris arrested and their property confiscated. Now, this is the first time we're actually learning about the Jews of Paris. Up until now, we've learned a lot about those Jews in Alsace-Lorraine, and I told you in that area between Paris and Alsace-Lorraine, but not so much about the Jews of Paris themselves. But now we're going to start hearing more and more about them. And so what did he do? He had, soon after his coronation, he had the Jews Paris arrested and their property confiscated. And you have to understand, mixed in with all these accusations against the Jews, it was always a pretext to steal their property, take it away from them, or then put these onerous taxes upon them. I mean, so there was always an economic framework for this. In 1172, the Jews from Paris. Now, again, I told you the kings at this point are just ruling around the area around Paris, called the Ile-de-France. They're not ruling over all of France, but that section. And so 1182, he has an official proclamation that the Jews in his area are banished. They have to leave. Because of the weakness of the monarchy, the lords of the other provinces were free to disobey the king. So in other words, the Jews always did have a place to go to relocate, but you can imagine what havoc this is in your life, that all of a sudden, to get, this mandate, this law coming down, from the ruler, that you have to leave. And I don't know how much time they were even given to gather up their belongings and relocate to another section. And this could happen numerous times over a Jew's lifetime, because they might be, first now they're out of Paris. There may be another town also doesn't want them, or they want to confiscate their wealth, so they'll also banish them. So this constant turmoil that the Jews are living under. But naturally, they want their money. So in 1198, the king allowed the Jews to return to his domain. But unfortunately, obviously, they were suffering greatly living under his rule. They continued to suffer under his successors, Louis VIII, that's 1223 to 1226, and Louis IX, we're going to learn more about him. That's Louis the Pious, or Saint Louis. And he rules from 1226 to 70. So I will tell you more about him, but right now I'm just telling you, how terrible the conditions were in general. Several dukes also independently banished their Jews. For those allowed to remain, severe restrictions were enacted to hamper the chief occupation left open to them, the usury. Okay, remember I told you before they couldn't own land, they could not have their own serfs or slaves. That's why they ended up becoming urban dwellers. And even there, they could never join the guilds because everything required a Christian oath. So they had very, very limited occupations open to them. And unfortunately, because they don't want the Christians, God forbid, to dirty their hands, lending money with interest to other Christians. But those Jews, those devilish Jews, they can do so. All right, and that's what happened. On occasion, various dukes even abrogated those loans owed to the Jews. This would be another good reason to attack the Jews, because let's just banish, let's get rid of them, because we owe them so much money. Let's just get rid of them. Then we don't have to ever pay back those debts. So that was unfortunately a byproduct, right? Or the raison d'etre behind why they might have get rid of the Jews temporarily. Then they would always invite them back at a certain point because they needed the money. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. I'm going to mention to you now a few other famous Rabbanim from this time period. They are all considered Baalei Tosfos. They are how much each of them might have contributed to the Tosfos that we are now printed in the Gemaras, but because they lived in that era, they are all under the aegis of considered to be the Baalei Tosfos. A disciple of Rabbeinu Tam was Rabbi Eliezer of Metz. Now Metz, I'm not sure, that's more to the east. I'm not sure if Metz is considered part of Alsace-Lorraine. It's certainly very close to that area. I don't have his full dates, but he lived somewhere around the year 1175. He served as an intermediary between the German and the French Tosfos. Right? After we finish with this time period of the French Tosfos of the 12th century, then I'm going to turn our attention to what's happening to the Jews in Germany, and then I will conclude going back to what happened in 13th century France. Okay. So he was sort of like a bridge, again, that would make sense if this is close to the Alsace-Lorraine area. So they are very close to that part of Germany. He conveyed the interpretations and the decisions of Rabbeinu Tam to the German region. In addition to his Tosfos commentary, he also wrote a book called Sefer Ya'arim, which is a famous halachic work, listing and commenting on the 613 mitzvot of the Torah. His work includes also dissertations on ethics. So it kind of was part and parcel of this work. Now, we already saw from the time period of the Gaonim, and the Gaonim go, let's say, approximately 600 to the year 1000, they're in Babylonia, that they already works are starting to be compiled to tell people what are the halachic implications of the discussions that are in the Gemara. If you should ever, look at the Gemara, actually I'm doing it now with Daf Yomi, it's basically discussions. Rabbi so-and-so says this, but Rabbi so-and-so says this, and then they bring down this proof, and that one brings that proof, sometimes from a pasuk somewhere in Tanakh, or other writings from the time period, the Mishnaic time period, the Brises or Tosefta, and they have a discussion. But they don't really tell you at the end of the discussion what the halacha actually is, right? So gradually, works on halacha going to be published. And also this would then be a concrete guide for the Jews living in this time there. So they know how to practically follow, Jewish law is. The main thrust of Tosfos scholarship, though, right after the death of Rabbeinu Tam, came from the efforts of his nephew. That's why they all say that, like so many of them were actually relatives of Rashi. And his name was Rabbi Yitzchok of Dampierre. And Dampierre is also, it's near Troyes and Ramaruk. So, those were towns somewhat near to one another, again, to the east of Paris, but it's not Alsace-Lorraine. He's actually known, he lived from 1120 to the year 1200. He's called the Ri. I mean, I'm not one who sits and studies, the Gemara, and I certainly have never really learned Tosfos, but I definitely have heard of the Ri, because he was a great French Jewish leader of this Baal Tosfos, all right? Second only to his uncle in prominence among the Tosfos, the Ri was the first main editor. We're going to learn about somebody else who was also an editor of the Tosfos, until eventually the version, again, that is today's printed version of the Gemara. So I hear a little sound. If somebody could just make sure you're muted, that would be great.
The TV, are you hearing the TV?
Yes, I can. So you need to mute yourself. Just mute yourself. That's fine. Okay. So again, the first one you have to remember, everything's written down in scrolls. So everything has to be compiled and obviously read through, make sure everything's accurate, and then put them together in some sort of orderly fashion, right? So again, first is the Ri, so that's the first person to start organizing all the material, and now we're going to continue beyond him. The Ri directed the Talmudical Academy at Ramaruk, but he later settled in Dampierre. Again, these are all towns in the same region, where he founded a flourishing yeshiva. His yeshiva became the largest in France by the end of the 13th century. So it obviously had, great prominence at that time period. He's also known as the Ri HaZaken because there were other colleagues and students also named Yitzchak at that time. So he became the elder statesman of French Jewry, and he assumed his uncle's mantle of leadership and responsibility. Under the Ri, the Tosfos method of Talmudic analysis reached its fullest expression. Just to explain again. So when one studies a page in the Gemara, you might first look at Rashi. Rashi's going to explain the words of the Gemara, just a clear way of comprehending what's under discussion, what the various issues are. But Tosfos are going to compare and contrast various sections of the Gemara that might be discussing the topic at hand. So, they took a different, not just strict, explanation, but now an elaboration of the actual Gemara text. Under the Ri, the Tosfos method of Talmudic analysis reached its fullest expression. His name is mentioned on most pages of the Tosfos, and even many of the insights given anonymously are attributed to him in other sources. He was a very holy person. He lived an ascetic life. I don't know how he did this. He actually fasted for 2 consecutive days to commemorate Yom Kippur. I mean, we find one day hard enough to imagine 2 full days of fasting. He became the prototype for the Tosfos of the 13th century. I guess they became more and more ascetic as time went on. These Tosfos were as well known for their piety and asceticism as for their brilliance and intellect. So I guess if you are considered to be a Baal Tosfos, so you will adopt that same way of learning and interpreting the Talmudic text, by comparing, I told you, and contrasting variant viewpoints and various Gemaras discussing the same topic, and then trying to make sense of everything. Rabbeinu Tam's disciples, also named Rabbi Yitzchok, as Rabbi Yitzchok ben Avraham, is called the Ritzbah. He lived from 1145 to 1210, and he succeeded the Ri as the head of the yeshiva in Tampere. He continued the work of his master in editing, revising, and publishing Tosfos commentaries. So there are a few people we can see already who are starting to, so to speak, edit, to compile, put together all the various scrolls that are around. He continued the work of his master. Okay. He edited, revised, and he published. Right. I'm making sure it was known. Again, everything is handwritten. I mean, it's really amazing, how these things. We actually have some documents that date back to
Did you want to look at the mark
period. Could you please mute yourself, please?
Yes,
Just mute
yes, I will.
yourself. Just mute it. That's the easiest way. You don't have to hear any noise. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. Many of his opinions, explanations are recorded throughout the edition of Tosfos that we currently possess. The Ritzbah was skilled in rendering practical decisions on difficult matters. Many of his responsa, so this would have been a separate thing. When I say responsa, those are sheilotim to shuvot, questions back and forth from various, communities, posing certain difficult situations or trying to understand perhaps how halacha, and they would pose it to the leading rabbanim of that day, and then they would respond. And again, this is called sheilotim teshuvot, or fancy word responsa. Many of his responsa were quoted by contemporary, even later authors. He was a well-known scholar whose halachic authority reached Provence, that's southern France, Austria, and even Spain. He was known to have been prompt in answering religious questions. That's nice. Sometimes, you can ask somebody a question. It might take them quite a while to get back to you, but he answered as promptly as it could be in those days, sending, documents over large distances, even when it became difficult for him to do so because of his poor health. Under his leadership, northern France was still able to retain much of its primary status in scholarship and halachic authority. Though life for the Jews of France remained increasingly difficult during the 12th century, scholarship remained at a high level, and there was a great flourishing of Talmudic discourse. All right, so we will, now we're going to turn our attention, and we're going to go to Germany. And I'll tell you what's happening to the Tosfos who live in that area. So let me move my French maps over and get my German material here. And I have some maps of Germany. So as we discuss certain communities, I will show you on the map where these places are located. Now it's interesting. The key Tosfos personalities, certainly in that 12th century, will be the Jews of France. But you see how their life is becoming increasingly difficult, and they're being banished from this location, that location. So by the time we get more actually into the 13th century, the main Tosfos will then be the German Tosfos. So again, it's just an umbrella thing calling them both countries together. So they're the Jews of Ashkenaz, and that refers to the Jews of France and Germany. The history of Jewry in Germany is closely bound with that of France. I mean, I think they both had the same mindset, the same way of interpreting. That's why they go under this umbrella title of Baalei Tosfos. It was a certain way of learning and studying. The history, so they're very, you can see the two countries are closely bound together. Even though at this point, originally most of the Jews are living, again, near that Rhine River, they're now going to spread further south and east. The cultural ties between the French and German Jewish communities existed for centuries. Travel seems not to have been hampered between the academies of the two countries, even during the Crusades. It seems remarkable. But on the other hand, there were gaps of 40, 50 years between each crusade. So obviously at certain time periods, things, were more peaceful, so it was considered safer, and they did do, a certain measure of traveling. The development of the French Tosfos academies with their unique approach to Talmudic studies was paralleled in Germany, although the work of the German scholars has come down to us in a different form than that of the French school. We'll see what they emphasize slightly differently. Where the thoughts of the French scholars exist for us largely in the collection of Tosfos. So again, when you're studying, not that I'm going to do, but if you're studying Tosfos, most of what you're reading there are the thoughts and opinions of French scholars, not the German ones as much. The German scholars' works have come down to us in a more individualized form, in halachic works of individual authors. These works differ from the French Tosfos not only in individualization, in other words, like, you'll hear more and more, Rabbi so-and-so wrote this, Rabbi so-and-so wrote that, all right? But in context and purpose as well. The goal of the Tosfos is the elucidation of the Talmudic text. I told you, right, they're going to go pour through them, compare, contrast, without attempting to apply the implications of their studies to practical halacha. But the main thrust of the works of the German school, right, is halachic application. So I think they were, I think their works obviously are then more accessible, more practical to the general Jew living in that time period. It's not as much so scholarly as a more of a practical application. To the German scholars, the Tosfos method was a vehicle. So in other words, by studying, though, the various arguments and comparing different things, you would come to a clearer picture, more of an understanding. And as a result, they could come to halachic conclusions relating to practical questions of law. The father of the German Tosfos was Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher. Again, we don't know his full dates, but he died around the year 1133, and he's known as the Riva. The Riva studied in Mainz. All right, Mainz is definitely that's that Rhine area, and later became a pupil of Rashi. I remember Rashi dies around the year 1104, 1105. After spending a few years as a merchant, which sometimes involved business trips, took him as far away as Russia, he repaired to Speyer, again, the same Rhine River area, where he gathered many disciples who later became the leaders of German Jewry. The last of the Tosfos, and we'll do much more about this individual later, was Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, and he dies in the year 1293, which will bring us to almost the very end, till the end of the 13th century. Rabbi Meir was the leader of all German Jewry and author of extensive responsa. He's actually, I think, most famous for what happened to him in his latter years, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Germany's great era of Talmudic scholarship ended with his death. So that's when we think about the Tosfos. So we're talking again 12th and 13th centuries. We're going to be starting with, again, Rashi's son, this Rabbi Meir, right? And we're in France, but the last, again, because things are so chaotic for French Jewry, starting especially in that 13th century. And then, so the last of the great Tosfos will be this Rabbi Meir, Rothenburg, from Germany. And Rothenburg is the name of a town in Germany. In spite of all the disasters heaped upon Ashkenazic Jewry during the time of the Crusades, the 12th and 13th centuries were a time of great accomplishments in Torah scholarship and Talmudic commentary. I actually think it's amazing. I mean, they lived under the most horrific conditions. I mean, look how we complain here, how we feel so confined to our homes and we can't get out and about. But I mean, thank God. I mean, our lives, we're not in fear that somebody's going to break into our house and attack our person and kill us and demolish. We're not afraid that all of a sudden we're going to get in order. We have to pick ourselves up and move to another community or even another country. But this was like their constant way of life, in those centuries, and always being accused of these most horrific things. I really, like, kol hakavod to them that they managed to survive and that they I guess maybe because things were so terrible outside that it turned so inwardly and focused so much, on studying the Torah and the Gemara, and gave them solace. It's just amazing. And because so many of these Rabbanim whose names I'm mentioning to you now, they are still continued to be studied to this very day. The development of authoritative halacha course. Remember, I told you that's the emphasis for the German Tosfos, and will be on halacha, not as much on just trying to analyze points, variant points in the Gemara itself. And this continued unabated, even with awful things, no matter what, they picked themselves up and again, would settle wherever they had to, but continuously study. Again, these are the greatest of the Rabbanim were doing this. It was during this period that Tosfos commentaries matured and were completed. Now, it might have gone through some revisions over the centuries. So the Tosfos that we have, the Gemara that we have today, I believe is a version that was printed in Vilna. So we're talking right into the 19th century. But the first one probably was printed in Italy, right? That's after the invention of the printing press. But we're still a few hundred years away from there. Everything is handwritten. It's amazing, and how they kept everything organized. It's phenomenal. The German Jewish communities developed in a slightly different manner from their French counterparts. The Jews in Germany never enjoyed the relative freedom that existed for French Jews before the Crusades. Up and past the Crusades, forget it. The German Jews had little contact with the non-Jewish world that surrounded them, and they turned inwardly in a much more intense manner. When we learned about some of those great French Jews, they were involved. They were merchants. They had vineyards. Obviously, as they integrated themselves somewhat more with the non-Jewish world. German Jews, their life is so horrible there. They're obviously they had to deal with the outside community from time to time, but not on let's say, a daily basis. The piety of German Jewry was legendary, and their spiritual leaders were known as Hasidei Ashkenaz. Now, these are not the Hasidim. When you think of Hasidim, that you're talking about the 1700s, and then you're talking about Poland, all right? But these very pious Jews, you'll see their influence a lot by Kabbalah. They're called Hasidei Ashkenaz. The leaders of French Jewry were referred to as Chachmei Tzarfat. So you can see, the difference, in emphasis. So here they were in France, they were trying to emphasize more of the learning and, reviewing the Gemara and trying to understand all its finer points. Whereas a lot of the Jews, not all, but many of the Jews in Germany were more influenced by spiritual matters. And you'll see they were influenced by the Kabbalah as well. This nuance of difference illustrates the emphasis that German Jewry placed upon individual attainment of holiness, punctilious in their observance of halacha and custom, the scholarship of the It's funny because you think later German Jewry, we're not considered them at all, to be, interested in Kabbalah, because that certainly changed over time. But at this juncture, right, we're talking 13th century, it was a great influence on their lives. So their lives were directed more towards ascertaining the halacha from the Talmud and less towards composing a detailed commentary on the Talmud. So obviously they would have continued learning and studying, but they were into more practical things or also more spiritual things. The German Talmudists, almost without exception, were men of Kabbalah and mystical bent. Again, I guess your lives are pretty miserable, so I guess that gives you, puts you in another realm, so, it could take yourself out of, your miserable existence. They were the main instruments for the popularization of Kabbalistic thought and behavior amongst the masses of Ashkenazic Jewry. This would actually even make sense because don't forget, ultimately, many of these Jews, right, living in France and Germany, will find their way ultimately to Poland and Lithuania. So you can understand, I mean, it wasn't like the Hasidim all of a sudden started inventing a lot of, their spiritualistic modes of thought. It obviously was there all along, but obviously they're going to put greater emphasis on it than, in the 18th century. These trends gave birth to a Jewish community whose inner life was so intensely Jewish that it practically ignored the world around it. The only thing it could not ignore, of course, were the attacks and brutalities of the German populace regularly visited upon it. Now I'm going to tell you the key person who was associated with this Baalei Chassid, with these Chassidim, Chassidei Ashkenaz, and his name is, did I move it? I turned the page, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, and he lived from the year 1150 to the year 1217. One of the foremost leaders of Chassidei Ashkenaz was Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. He was born in Speyer, so again, Alsace-Lorraine area, where he inherited vast Kabbalistic knowledge from his father, Rabbi Shmuel HaChassid. Obviously, was a great scholar in his own right. He was, and now we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda. He was an extremely pious man of solid faith who laid great emphasis on the underlying mythical intent of the prayers and on strict adherence to custom. It was his custom to fast nearly every day. We thought the other guy would fast for 2 days for Yom Kippur. I mean, this man's fasting much more frequently, eating only at night. He eventually settled. Of course, what does that make you think of? The Muslims do that, right? In their Ramadan, they don't eat during the day; they just eat at nighttime. He eventually settled in Regensburg, and let me see if I can show you where Regensburg is. It's further south, much further south. It's more like eastern, maybe they're in Bavaria. It's in eastern Germany. Okay, it looks like to me it's sort of closer actually to what we think of now as Czechoslovakia. So I think that's called Bavaria, that section of Germany, where he had numerous disciples there. Okay, now. How did he, disseminate his thoughts? He wrote a book. It's called Sefer Hasidim, and it's one of the most colorful works to come down to us from this age. Here, alongside the most lofty ethical instruction, inspiration to the worship of God through prayer, so big emphasis on davening, you can see, thoughts on the themes of reward and punishment, sin and penitence. One also finds detailed practical guidance on halachic questions pertaining to the laws of Shabbos, eating, and other matters. So you can see, a shifting away from the scholarship that we find with the French Tosfos, and now we're going into some more, as I say, practical applications, understanding what is the actual halacha and paying attention to our tefillot. Rabbi Yehuda's method of teaching ethics by citing specific examples from life experience rather than by formulating abstract principles endeared this classic work to scholar and layman alike, because over the centuries, people had written works of ethics, but some of them, they're on such a high level for a regular person to read them and understand them. It was very, very difficult. So he's writing it on a level that any Pasha Jew could open it up and read this, and understand what he's referring to. Interspersed throughout his Sefer are instructions based on Kabbalah rather than halacha. So it's interesting. So big emphasis on halacha, but the spiritual aspect is equally important to them. This work was widely accepted throughout the Jewish community and was later endorsed by many halachic greats. An example from the Sefer, here's so interesting, is the widely held custom to refrain from marrying a woman with the same name as one's mother. I thought that's so interesting. I mean, I did vaguely remember hearing about this or learning about this, but now we know you can date it and I can actually place it. It's 13th century Germany. Rabbi Yehuda also wrote liturgical poetry. Think of this now. What's his most famous composition? Shir HaKavod. On Shabbos, when we go back to Shul, right? David in the Shul. That's Anim Zemiros. He wrote that. It closes the Shabbos service. He also wrote numerous other Kabbalistic works as well as books on halacha. He is mentioned in Tosfos. So that's why I say that's why it all goes under the umbrella title of these are all Baalei Tosfos, right? And his influence has remained steadfast down through the ages. Even the Christian nobles sought his counsel and blessing and deemed him a miracle man. So he's obviously, a highly respected individual. Now we're going to move now to the second half of the 13th century. What's going on? Still in Germany. Now I'm going to talk a little in generalities, of some other key individuals, and then we'll go eventually to Rabbi Meir Rothberg, who is considered, again, the last of the Tosfos. In spite of all the disasters, wait, let me see, did I skip something? Make sure I have all my notes together here properly. Hold on. Okay. The tribulations of Jewry did not end with the Crusades, which were merely the precursors of scores of local oppressions and massacres. Jews were severely restricted economically and taxed exorbitantly. I'm just going to give you a litany of what happened. In 1241, the entire community of Frankfurt on Main was butchered by a murderous mob. And in 1285, the same fate befell the Jews of Munich. So again, we're talking about southern and more eastern Germany. At this time, there was a direct relationship between the power of the Holy Roman Emperor and the safety of the Jews. Frederick II, we had learned about him before, was a strong ruler and on the whole protected the Jews under his direct rule. His death in 1250, though, okay, I told you it's going to be a demarcation now, and that of his son Conrad were followed by about 20 years during which Germany was without a king. These were among the cruelest years the Jews in Germany had to endure. Dozens of towns, cities, and provinces had their own local persecutions. Sometimes the Jews succeeded in buying the protection of a particular baron or the bishop, but this usually meant further impoverishment and consequently greater weakening of their status. As I said, I can hardly imagine how horrible it must have been to live, at this time period. And like Kol HaKavod, that they continued with their scholarship, but they continued with their lives. And it's to me, it's just amazing. What strength, inner strength they had to have survived. In spite of all the disasters heaped upon German Jewry at this time, the 13th century was a time of great accomplishment in Torah scholarship and Talmudic commentary. So I'm going to mention to you a few names here. You might, some of these are familiar to me. I certainly never sat and studied them, but I guess maybe when different rabbis are giving sermons or something, I have heard some of these names, these works, these rabbonim, and although I did once ask my son Yechiel, he says that these are not necessarily studied to this day as whole sfarim, or maybe a later Torah giant will make reference to these works and maybe quote something. So so their legacy has continued, although perhaps the entirety of their works is not studied. So again, it was a great flowering rate of Torah scholarship, Talmudic commentary. The development of authoritative halachic works continued unabated. Remember, big emphasis on halacha for German Jewry. The development, it was during this time period, this Tosfos commentaries matured and were completed. Among the great works compiled during this time was Sefer Zechira. I'm just going to mention the names. You'll not be so familiar, but just so you know, all the different communities. I think it's interesting. Different towns all over Germany had great, leaders, scholars. There was the Sefer Zechira by Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn. And Avi Ezri, he also, a book on halacha that was composed by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi of Cologne. Just, you don't have to couldn't possibly remember their names, but just say, so we're talking about Bonn. We already talked about the Jews Alsace-Lorraine area. Now we're learning about Jews further south and to the east in Germany. So here we're now talking about Bonn, Cologne. Cologne is Alsace-Lorraine. And near Alsace-Lorraine, it's the Rhine River area. Another well-known Rav of this time was Rav Elazar Rokeach of Worms. So I get maybe they're really, remember the Yisui Rokeach company? They actually had their plant in New Jersey. I mean, I don't think they exist anymore. At least I don't remember seeing. It must have been bought up by one of the other larger, kosher, businesses. He wrote this book called Sefer Rokeach. I'll tell you a little bit more about it, which was an ethical and halachic work. He's also known as the final editor. Remember, we said there are of Dampierre was an editor. Now he's going to be the final editor of Tosfos, and it's now considered our standard text, of that great work. So obviously the scrolls came down then. We're talking about 13th century up until, you know, the 1500s when the printing press will be invented, you know, and that's, it will finally be, and the first edition will be in Italy. I'll tell you a little bit more about him because it has some interesting things about his life. Okay, so he lived from 1160 to 1238. Again, he was descendant of the Colonimus line. Now, this goes back, those of you who have been following me, obviously I've been doing this for several years. The Colonimus were great Torah scholars from Italy, and they're actually invited to France by Charlemagne. We're going back to the 800s, right? So he's a descendant, you know, of these great Colonimus Rabbanim. He's best known for that work I mentioned to you, Sefer Rokeach. Why does it have a name? It's a guide to ethics and halacha. The title Rokeach, HaRokeach means the perfumer. And it alludes to the, first I thought maybe it was the perfume, but that's not the case. It alludes to the author's name since the numerical value of the word Rokeach is equivalent to that of Elazar, and that's his first name. He also wrote other works on halacha, a commentary to the Torah and the 5 Megillot, as well as Tosfos to the tractate Bava Kama. So again, his name, I guess, will not appear in other, you know, tractates, but in Bava Kama it will mention, and it will tell you that this was this Rabbi Rokeach, you know, who wrote such and such a commentary. And then, in addition, he's considered to be the final editor of Tosfos, those that appear again in today's standard text. He also learned Kabbalah from his father in Mainz, again, also that's the Rhine area, as well as from Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. They both transmitted to him the mystical meanings and correct text of their prayers. And he subsequently wrote a Kabbalistic commentary on their prayers in manuscript form. Apparently, it was only recently discovered, you know, and now obviously it's published. And now another sad thing about his end of his life. In 1197, there was an attack on the Jews in Worms. Again, we're still talking about that Rhine River area during the Second Crusade. So the same Second Crusade, you know, where Rabbeinu Tam was so viciously attacked. So what happened here in Worms? Rabbi Elazar's wife and 2 daughters were slaughtered before his very eyes. The Crusaders then wounded him and his young son, although both did somehow manage to survive. So it's just amazing. I tell you how they continue their lives, and I personally just find it phenomenal. Let me just go back up and finish this up now. And another Rav, I just wanted you might have heard perhaps somebody ever mentioned his works. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak of Vienna. So we see Jews are already in Austria. All right. He wrote an authoritative halachic work called Or Zarua. The sequence of this sefer follows that of the Talmud's tractates and provides valuable insight into the Tosfos. Thus, great accomplishments in Syrian tragedy walked hand in hand. I'm just going to give you one more, and then next time we'll discuss Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg in greater detail. In 1273, a new emperor was finally chosen, Rudolph I. He was a member of what had been the former comparatively unimportant family of Habsburg. So this is going to be the great Habsburg. Ultimately, they will, you know, will move, you know, to Austria-Hungary, and that will be the Habsburg Empire. He set for himself the task of making his family rich and powerful. As he needed to raise money, who does he turn to? He sold charters of protection to the Jews of various towns. Emperor Rudolph played a key role with the foremost Rav of his time and the last of the Baalei Tosfos, and we'll see how he interacted with Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. But I believe our time is up now, so we will continue again with the very last, the great Tosfos, who will be Rabbi Meir of the town of Rothenburg. Okay, so everybody should be well. You should have a happy Hanukkah. And actually, when we meet next time, so we'll be on the last day of Hanukkah. So only should be good. Stay in good health, please God. That's the most important thing. And we will continue our studies of the Jews in Europe. Not such
Thank
a
you very much. Thank you.
Lots to learn.
Malka.
My great pleasure. Hello, goodbye to everybody. Take it easy. Again, happy Hanukkah.
Are your notes online?
They are. It's actually. Wait. Let me adjust my communication. Just a second. So I don't know if even the people, those of you who might live in Century Village, if you're getting this, but I got an email, wait, give me a second, from Andrea in the Shoal office.
Yeah.
And she said you can download everything. Let me just find where I have your thing.
So you're,
And you're gonna have to write down.
that's nice.
Okay, so if you want any of this information written down, okay,
Right.
so you have to go to www.torah-or-boca. All right, so that's TORAH
Right.
HRBOCA. It's all one word, all right? Do you want me
Right.
to repeat it?
I have
All right, so it's Torah or Boca, okay, .org.
org.
Then you need a slash,
Slash.
and she put it under women's dash learning.
Is there an apostrophe in women's?
She has not an apostrophe, but she has a dash between women's and learning. And then she has, it looks like another dot, and then you just conclude it with HTML. Again, I don't know if that part's necessary.
Learning
But,
dot.
you need a torah-or-boca.org/women's, but dash learning.
Oh, there.
Okay, and then all my material, as I produce it, I send it to her when we
Oh,
need new maps.
Great.
Also send her the maps, so everything would be ultimately available. On the-
Yeah, I'm sorry that I come in late. I go to my daughter's presentation before that.
Oh, well,
And then
that's
it's like it's a chance to talk to her and see her and
It's so funny. Not only teaching ladies in Boca Raton, I'm also now have somebody in Detroit
That's
and people from Rochester. So it's actually very nice. I have people from several different communities.
well,
And
you
it's my
know.
pleasure. It's so nice to see all your faces also, which is
right.
fantastic.
Well, I really enjoy this class and I hate
Oh,
coming in
thank
late, but as I
Yeah.
said, just the chance to see my daughter and my son on the
Right.
screen at the same time. It's such a
Right.
pleasure. So,
Right. But
okay.
it also be good. Please, God, we were going to get that shot. I don't know
Oh,
whenever, hopefully within the next few
planning.
months, and we can start traveling again
Yeah.
and seeing